Bill and I are going to get into the nitty-gritty of what we talked about yesterday. We probably whetted your appetite and left you wondering, what the heck is all this stuff about? And so stable approach criteria and new citation jet pilot practices. So I want to kick off for the new folks here. I got some really nice feedback from many of you about how you appreciate the safety work we're doing. I think it's really a lot of fun, number one, and it allows us to share common practices, makes us comfortable sharing our scenarios that we've been through that we can all learn from the easy way. But I want to, especially for the new folks here, I want to lay out a couple of philosophical things that we do. We call our standard operating SOPs, the P is practice, not procedure, and we did that intentionally because we aren't your management team. You don't work for us. You have your own aircraft. You've earned your way into this airplane. You enjoy it. You operate it the way you want to because you have that freedom. And so in airline world, where Bill comes from, and in the military, SOP means standard operating procedure. Procedure implying that you must comply and do this. We know we can't impose that on you, so we call it standard operating practice. And practice implies that we've collected the best ideas on how to do certain things from all of you, and we've suggested in our SOPs what we find to be the best practice that you can adopt or choose to adopt or not to adopt. The same thing applies for what we're doing with the cue card that's on your desk today. So we've boiled down everything that the working group did and then the simulator test pilots did in Wichita into a card that you can use and take with you and start to think about. And yesterday we mentioned that this is an 18-month initiative because it's simple, but it's not easy to put into practice. And we will do dissections of it over time in the coming months to allow you to understand a little bit more about how to apply this to your flying. And as an aside, I'll tell you that I gave a teaser on this at the NBAA convention last week, and one of the Aviation Week writers came up to me afterwards. He happens to be a Gulfstream pilot himself for a flight department. He writes and edits routinely for Business and Commercial Aviation magazine for Aviation Week. And he said, this is changing the way I fly already, just in the last week. He's writing a feature article on it for Aviation Week that you'll get to see. And he and I are talking about the nuances that are in there. So there's a lot to this behind it. It took us 3 days to get the working group up to speed. And you're only getting a chance to see it for a couple hours here yesterday and today. But this is a first step on a journey to apply something that should become very simple in the long term, but understanding the detail behind it's going to take some time. So that's why we're doing what we think will be about an 18-month initiative. Each of the things on the card will have some rationale behind them. We can hand you a practice to go apply, but if you don't know the why to it, it makes it hard for you to internalize it and say, I get why we're doing this, and I buy into it, and I'm going to do it because I buy into it because I understand it. And that's what's going to take us some time. So today, Bill and I are going to make a great attempt at getting you introduced to each of the pieces of this. Take the card home with you, start to think about it when you fly. You'll see there's a green column and a red and yellow column. The green column's when everything's cool, and there's only 3 calls to make when everything's cool, and you should be able to apply that pretty easily in the beginning. But it's kind of one of those don't try this on your own at home kind of things. So we're going to do some videos. We're going to do a lot more with it, and it'll get adapted into the training that we do with flight safety and other training providers. But it's a journey for us, and I think, as the Aviation Week writer said, it's got a really big game changer in the long run. So we're going to take our time and learn to do it well, and that's what Bill and I are going to attempt to introduce this morning. So Bill, over to you.
We need to.
We got to get it on the
main screen.
On the big screen. There we go. Okay. So this is what we call a Safe to Land initiative, and it involves approach gates and verbal calls for validation. That's the part we'll go into today. There are other elements of this that will come out in the future. Top of descent briefing to prep for properly doing this. We'll have some new suggestions for that. A streamlined checklist. Yesterday, Bill talked about metering tasks upstream. There are 14 steps in our approach to land checklist. Should we be doing 14 steps in a checklist fashion on a radar downwind or extended base? Probably not. So we're looking at how do we do more things uphill at the before descent at the 18,000 foot point and limit the number of things we actually have to do when we get into the short hairs. Simulator training curriculum, incorporating the gates, touchdown zone awareness, braking operations, and then in-aircraft instruction. So all of that will be part of the overall program.
Thanks, Charlie, and good morning again, everybody. First, before we get into that, we wanted to do something else. We're going to hijack a little bit of time here. Captain Chief Pilot David Miller. Okay, a few questions here. Presage, we work in many industries, all kinds of industries, and we always like to collect data. And we're going to ask you today to help us collect some data through some survey questions. It's only going to take a few minutes. I really need your honest answers. I need your participation. Marty, Piyush are going to be counting the responses very quickly. They're fast at this, but I really need your participation and honesty. So, first question. You are driving on a 3-lane highway. Speed limit's 55 miles an hour, national speed limit. It's a nice day, no traffic. And no police, guaranteed. You don't tell me how you know, you just guaranteed no police. 55 miles an hour, no traffic, nice day. Who is going, raise your hand to who agrees they will go over 55 miles an hour? Marty, Piyush, you got a count there? Perfect. 1%. All right, okay, thank you very much. Same highway. Speed limit's 55, nice day, no traffic, same conditions, but today police are there. They were guaranteed to pull you over. They're not going to fine you. They're going to tap on your window and say, hey, you know you're going over 55? Yeah? Okay, have a nice day. But they pulled you over, inconvenience. That's for sure going to happen. Okay? Who is going to go over 55 miles an hour?
One guy in the back.
You got a count there? What, 3? Yeah, perfect.
Piyush, you are?
Good. There'll be a point to this afterwards. Driving on a 3-lane highway, speed limit now 70 miles an hour. Nice day, no traffic, no police, guaranteed, 70 miles an hour. Who's going to go over the speed limit? Okay, all right. Maybe not complete agreement, but close to. A little different scenario. Entering a tight curve. Nice dry day. Warning to slow speed to 45 miles an hour. Okay? It's a caution sign, 45 miles an hour. Who is going to slow to 45 miles an hour? I like it. I drive a Prius, okay?
Driving a...
Yeah, my next one's a Tesla. Your own car. Who's going to go over 45? Slow to 45. Who's going to slow to 45? Nobody, okay. Same curve, it's a wet day, warning to slow to 45 miles an hour, and you have knowledge that 3 accidents occurred on that curve in wet conditions. Who's going to slow to 45? Okay. So, except for number 3, between the speed limit of 55 and the police pulling you over, I changed your behavior with a little bit of oversight, a little soft oversight. I changed your behavior. Going 55 to 70 miles an hour, a more realistic policy, changed only a little bit of behavior. So maybe that policy change was not quite good enough. And by giving you information, critical information about a risk, we changed everybody's behavior. So these are an easy way to remember, we can change behavior by manipulating those 3 legs of the stool, by changing things a little bit. And that's what we're doing in these procedures. We're hopefully going to change behavior when it's important by giving you simple guidance. Okay, so let's look at the new approach SOPs, standard operating practices. Priming the pump to go around first. So in today's world, we have the stable approach goal of 1,000 feet or 500 feet. What's the current?
1,500.
1,005, okay. And that's also the point, the limit where you have to go around. So the goal and the limit are the same. It's hard to reconcile that, trying to be perfect, and also the limit at the exact same time. So what we want, and these are two separate objectives. One to be stable, another one to go around when you should. So we want to separate those and keep the good, which is the goal, and the limit, which is when you need to execute the go around, and separate them, okay? So we're going to separate and establish a goal and a limit, and in between provide a warning. Look at the example of an EGPWS. It doesn't all of a sudden go whoop, whoop, pull up. You first get a terrain, terrain, terrain. There's a warning. And in that warning, you're getting prepared. You're priming the pump to potentially the next warning, which just says whoop, whoop, pull up. So you're getting prepared for that action. And this is what we're doing in this process as well. So the working group established goals and limits. They created warnings in between that goal and limit, and assigning personal responsibility that felt personal responsibility, accountability. Remember I read the statistics from the simulator trial that 100% felt more responsibility to themselves to comply? That's what we were after. So this is what it looks like, the new stability calls in the stable case. And note, this is very distinct from the IFR calls you make. So these are separate. So the goal, which is the good, is this objective of being configured at 1,000 feet and being fully stable at 500 feet. And you'll call out 1,000, 500, we'll talk about 200 in a second, either through an auto call out if it's available on your model, and Charlie's going to show you how to create this in certain conditions, or you talk aloud. And I can tell you in the simulator trials, I had never seen this before done so well by some of your members that just naturally, as the way they fly, talk aloud about what they're seeing, what they're doing, what they're thinking, what's coming up. This talk aloud strategy is really effective. So at 1,000 feet, you'll call configured. 500 feet, call stable in response to the 1,500. And at the limit now, the new go-around gate, the limit, you call 200 and continue if things are stable. We don't call landing anymore because landing is suggestive that that's what you're going to do when in reality, the go-around is still active and alive right up until the final point of ground flaps deployed. Mm-hmm. So we want to keep that door open for a go-around and not call landing. So your call is continue. I'm just going to keep on continuing to my landing. So this is the stable case. When you're unstable now, let's say at 1,000 feet, because that's the configuration gate, if you don't have the flaps or gear down, you'll follow that 1,000-foot call by a flaps or gear call. You'll make that call out aloud to yourself. And you'll repeat that until it is completed. At 500 feet, and I'll use the example of a parameter, say it's airspeed, fast airspeed, you'll call airspeed 200. I'm going to break that down in a second. So the parameter that's out of tolerance is airspeed, and we want you to repeat that. Airspeed, airspeed, 200, airspeed, until you fix it. Now, why repeat it to yourself when you already know that? It sounds kind of goofy. It sounds goofy to me, but it actually works. It keeps it more conscious, top of mind. A GPWS system doesn't stop calling terrain. It keeps calling terrain until you fix a problem or you reach a limit and you have to go around with a whoop, whoop, pull up. So this is the same. And you'll repeat this. It sounds goofy. Goofy is not wrong. It's still very, very effective. So then when you get to 200, if you're still unstable, you'll call limit, because that's your limit, and go around. Now this is all compressed, so it seems like a lot in a short period of time, but when you see it in the video and in real life, it's stretched out. It's not that congested. So most of your approaches are visual approaches, right? Most runway excursions occur in visual conditions, but we don't always provide visual limits to our stable approach definition, stable approach parameters. Why not, when that's the most common type of approaches you do? So we've built that into your definition of unstable or stable guidelines. And this is what they are, down to 200 feet. But before I talk about that, I should have mentioned, is 200 feet safe? Just because the group says lower than 500 is more in my mental model, is it safe to go to 200? You have to do a safety analysis on top of that. And the working group did. In fact, they looked at the Flight Safety Foundation's analysis that they did and adopted that. That analysis was really done for larger aircraft, so it fit the smaller business community as well. So they adopted that risk analysis. Now, Charlie, you can help me out with this. So in the stable approach definition, the old one was VREF -5 to +20.
+20, that's right.
So we've narrowed it down now to +10. So you've got to be more precise at 500 feet to be perfectly stable. But the difference now is if you're outside of that tolerance, you can continue and fix that minor instability by 200 feet. Part of that allowance to go below 500 feet, though, is if in your professional opinion, your expertise, you will be stable by 200. It's not meant to, for egregious cases, there's no way you're going to make it, that you should go below 500. You should go around up there. This is for those minor instabilities that clearly you believe you can be stable by 200 feet. So a tighter airspeed tolerance, but an allowance to go below 500 feet. 15 degrees of bank. That is the definition that's been adopted for a stable approach by 200 feet. You shouldn't be doing more than 15 degrees of bank to correct back to the runway by 200 feet. We've included a new visual guideline of the extended runway edge lines. You can see that there on the picture. That is your tolerance. Okay, if you're not exactly on the center line, but you can move off to the side a little bit, the tolerance is your visual extension of those runway edge lines. And vertically, using the PAPI guidelines. We're going to get into that a little bit more in a few slides. So this picture here you're seeing is your chief pilot, Captain David Miller, doing one of his better flights. And I'm going to ask you, I'm going to point the pointer here. I'm not sure if this is coming up on the side, guys. So is this flight stable under this new definition? Well, first of all, let's look at the altitude here. It's really hard to see, but he's just above 200 feet. Okay, so keep that in mind. His bank angle here is 22 degrees. And he looks like he's just slightly outside the extended runway edge line. So, first of all, is he stable under the new definition? Should he go around? He's above 200 feet. Technically, he has a little bit of room left. Yes, you're absolutely correct. So this was just a snapshot we took in a simulator, which is, it just was kind of perfect for this. So this was just getting to the point, nearly 200 feet, 22 degrees of bank, just a little bit outside the edge line. If you don't have this in the next few feet, you should be doing a go-around.
And you're getting into the question of rationale, which is really important because the working group, debated. Let's go back one for just a second. Debated what constitutes in your own mind something that the pucker factor is too high. I need to get out of here. And so we talked about these edge lines. And interestingly, for a wider runway, the edge lines are going to be further out. Right? So you could actually be physically from the center line further away than on a narrow runway, so that the criteria gets tighter on the narrow runway. If you put yourself in this position and you try to correct below 200 feet, you're going to find you're going to be very difficult to get back on the center line without an overshoot or two, which sets you up for a touchdown off center with drift. and that's not where we want to be. So the group said, yeah, that feels like I'm going to be at that pucker factor. Like I mentioned yesterday, you're coming down final, you're on an instrument approach, the weather's at minimums, you may or may not break out, you're up on your edge of your seat, you're on your game, ready to go around. That's where we want you to feel that same kind of sense of urgency when you see this picture. You've bought into this being on the edge of what you can do, so let's quit and let's go around and do something else. That curve we showed yesterday of the risk of continuing was low way out on approach, but as you get into this point, the risk of continuing is going up. And overlaid on top of that, the risk of go-around felt higher when you were further out on approach, but now it stayed constant, that same risk of going around, going through the procedures, pickle, power, pitch, flaps, gear, flaps, all of that complexity now is a less risky choice than continuing to try to put it on the ground in this situation. So the rationale to get you to buy into, yeah, this is my tolerance in my mental model, that's as far as I'll take it too. So this is what the learning will be in your training for this over the coming period of time. So let's take a look at how that marries up with some mathematics in the next chart, Bill, if you would.
I'm just going to add one more thing,
go ahead.
Charlie.
Yeah.
You remember yesterday we showed a slide that had all the different instabilities that were occurring, and there was a long list, and we had 4 or 3 of them identified in red. There was airspeed, flight path deviation, and crosswind. Those are the most common instabilities that cause runway excursions. These are addressing all those primary instabilities.
And we, the team, the working group said VREF -5 to +20 is good at 500 feet, but then what after that? Is it still good at the threshold to be +20? Well, probably not, right? So let's set the actual goal tighter, but we don't have to be there and commit to it till later. And we can recognize you can be a little out of tolerance up higher, and you can still fix it at less risk than the go-around risk, but not being outside of that limit down low. And so that was kind of the philosophy of what went into some of this thinking. Okay, so a little bit more on the rationale side. So this comes from the 1 dot. We all use 1 dot exceedance is getting to be too much, right, when you're in the weather. It turns out that edge of that runway extension on the visual, if it's a 150-foot wide runway, from the center line, the edge of the runway is 75 feet, right, half of 150. Turns out that 1 dot, when you are 200 feet above the ground, this is from the Airman's Information Manual, is 100 feet. So 1 dot is a little bit more of a deviation on a 150-foot wide runway than our visual criteria is. It's pretty darn close. It's within 25 feet of what 1 dot is. So in our mental model, it all starts to converge, and we're starting to get into this point of we've gone from an instrument PFD-oriented kind of approach to looking at things outside with visual references to give us tighter, more accurate end-game indications of where we are. Okay, so here's where we're at.
Yeah, so that was the approach. What about landing? The cupboard is really bare when we talk about landing, standing, operating practices. Really bare, in the commercial world too. Charlie, you're going to walk through that?
Yeah, so here's another scenario. I'll go through it really quickly. This is a citation CJ2 going into Dexter, Maine in 2002. And he had 2 serious, 2 minor injuries. This airport runway was only 3,000 feet long, 3,000. It was dry. Day VFR with a tailwind. He didn't know how much the tailwind was until later, unfortunately. Weather condition with the tailwind, you can see the causes and findings down below. In-flight planning, improper decision to land, airspeed excessive, descent rate excessive, and an aborted landing. He actually tried to go around afterwards when he was more than halfway down the runway and ended up running over the end and pretty badly hurt. So an unnecessary result for a lot of different reasons, but we'll get into how this approach to planning and executing a landing could have made a big difference for this particular individual.
So touchdown point limit. Boy, you got the answers in the Jeopardy thing yesterday really well. I'm not even sure we need to go through this. Touchdown point limit. When you go down and you land after a float or something, how do you know when to go around? You got a landing distance and a runway, but how do you know where that line is? That's what we're going to bring into the standard practices. So when we look at the landing distance available, that was a question too. Landing distance available, LDA. That's the whole runway. Your landing distance required is comprised of an air distance from the threshold to touchdown, and a ground distance you need to brake and stop. What is left, we call the extra distance. Makes sense, simple, the runway. All we're going to do is move that extra distance and butt it up against the air distance so you have the ground distance to stop, okay? So let's say you do your normal air distance and you hit a gust of wind, or it's a hot runway and you get some ground effect that you don't expect. You start floating, floating, floating all the way down that extra distance. You want to make sure you get down by the point that you have ground distance to stop. That is our touchdown point limit, TPL. It's as simple as that. But now we're giving you a visual point on where you make that decision.
So you remember in the in-flight guide, it defines it as the point at which you need to be on the ground and braking, or you will have an excursion. The challenge is that the airplane's flight manual calculated number is the two blue numbers. It's the air distance and the ground distance, right? You have to dissect the ground distance out of that and know what that is, because the float has taken and put that air distance behind you. So that part we can give ourselves credit for, even though we're floating. We need to know what part of the total distance in the manual for landing from 50 feet was the ground distance, and that's what we're going to show you. Does that make sense? So far, so good? Sing out if not. Okay.
So you'll see a theme here. So we're going to apply the goal and a limit now to the landing. Okay? Same design as the approach. But now we're defining, okay, the goal, CJP working group, like the term green touchdown zone. This is the bullseye on the runway we want to touch down in. And they're defining that from the 500-foot marker to the 1,500-foot marker. Remember all these paint marks on the runway? Someone puts them there for a reason. Let's use them. By the way, if you didn't know, the distance starts at the beginning of the paint, not at the end of the paint or middle. It's the beginning of the paint is where the distance begins. So your GTZ, your green touchdown zone, 500 to 1,500 feet. If you haven't touched down by then, guess what? A warning. You're going to repeat this to yourself again. Floating, 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 and you keep saying floating until you either touch down or you reach, you guessed it, a limit, the TPL. And if you reach that point and you haven't touched down, you're not going to have the ground distance to stop, so you have to go around. So same concept. Goal, warning, limit. And the call is limit. Remember, on the approach, the call was limit as well. On the landing, the call is limit, go around. So there's some consistency. I'm going to hand this to Charlie to talk about some of the numbers here in a second. This is the runway and the approach that we used in the simulator testing. Okay, this is what the test pilots, the go-around test pilots used. And you'll see how they applied it in the test, the survey.
Yeah, so this is the Hamptons. By the way, if you go to flight safety, you can do a lot, what they call line-oriented simulator training scenarios, and they'll take you to the Hamptons and give you a wet runway scenario, and it's really kind of intriguing to fly. We used it in the simulator trials with the members, and it worked really, really well. And I'm going to run you through a TPL calculation real quick, so just follow me along here. So you've got a runway length of 4255. In this particular airport, that's also the landing distance available. We'll show you that there's the runway length published on the chart on your runway diagram is not always the same as landing distance available due to things like displaced thresholds. But for this airport, they're the same. So the formula is to take basically and figure out your margin of runway that exceeds the runway required in the manual to stop. So here we are with 4255 is the landing distance available. The calculated airplane flight manual for this airplane for this was 2364. And what we want you to do is factor that up, right? We don't want you to be test pilots. So yesterday we said we want you to use 25%, give yourself 25% onto that 2364. So that's adding roughly another 600 feet, and it comes out to 2955, call it 3,000. So we're going to subtract 3,000 from the 4255. That gives you about 1,200, almost 1,300. Then we're going to have you add back 1,000. Give yourself credit for that air distance, 1,000 feet. Why is it 1,000? Remember that our flight manual says that the guys at Textron who did the landing data get to 50 feet at the threshold, they pull it to idle, and they land on that 3-degree glide path, and that equates to a touchdown point on the runway of roughly 1,000 feet. It's actually 960, but 1,000 feet is what we give you back because you've already done that from the threshold to the flare, and you're in a few feet off the ground, right? So that 1,000 feet you can get back. So the calculation led to a touchdown point limit value of 2,300, which when you then get the airfield diagram out, there's a scale on the diagram. You can actually run your finger down and find something that's easy to identify that corresponds to 2,300 feet. In this case, it's the intersection of the other runway. Now you have a visual as you're coming in on final of where your touchdown point limit will be.
So at 1,300 feet that Charlie talked about is that extra distance you're taking advantage of.
We took the 2,300 feet, which was the amount the flight manual said, we divided it into 1,000 feet in the air and 1,300 feet on the ground.
So what happens when it's wet?
So now you got a bigger problem, right? Because we're going to factor up for 1.25 a wet distance, which is even bigger, and our yellow zone went away. This is a tough spot to be in, right? So now your 500 to 1,500 foot zone is really tight. You got to be in it, you got to be on it, and you got to know that you may need to go around much sooner.
Absolutely. You'll notice there is no warning zone. It kind of ate that up as well. So this is something you'd pay attention to in your threat analysis before you even start descent.
So it sounds like Lufkin yesterday, right? And it's also going to sound like the CJ2 I'm going to show you here in a little bit, but the 1,000 foot part was right there, and that's your touchdown point limit. And the individual at Lufkin thought he touched down around 1,000 feet, and Peter showed us he was much further down the runway than that.
So your awareness will be heightened now, and you'll have a limit, you'll have a point. That pump will be primed to go around.
Okay, so here's what happened to the individual in the CJ2. Short runway, 3,000 foot with 10 knots of tailwind. He had a VREF of 108. His as-flown glide path was 3.8 degrees, even though the published glide path here was 3 degrees. He had 1,700 feet a minute, 19 seconds before touchdown, and he was really at 130 knots. He had EGPWS warnings going off for sink rate. His calculated distance required was 3,150 feet. The ground roll portion of that, according to Cessna, was 1,900. So they actually gave him 1,200 feet of air distance instead of the 1,000 that we're using just for simplicity. And the actual touchdown, he needed 2,540 feet. That's without any factoring. So his runway available of 3,000, if you look at the margins, he had minus 150 feet of margin, assuming airplane flight manual data. He claimed he was going to touch down early, 460 feet. He still, in that case, only had 600 feet of margin, still with no factoring it up. If he had factored it up, he had 3,175 feet required in a factored condition, even touching down early, which is 175 feet more than the runway. So if he had done any of these numbers, he said, geez, this is not a good place to be landing today. Might have avoided this. So again, we reiterate what the formula is down there. With our safety factor, 3,000 minus 3,175 plus 1,000 is 825 feet. If not on the ground, on speed, fully braking, by 825 feet, you're going off the end. That's basically what the math tells us. So now we've got a tool that says none of us should ever be in that situation once we've touched down and gone to ground flaps that we wonder, am I going to get it stopped? Should never have that ugly feeling.
Yeah, and what jumped out at me is applying max braking. When have you been trained to apply max braking? Have you ever done it? It'd be too bad to have to do it for the first time in real life like this. Oh, okay, so we talked about the stuff going down the runway, the overruns. Remember, 50% of runway excursions go off the side of the runway. Again, we got very little guidance when we're over that runway what to do. Yes, we know to land on the center line, okay? So what about the lateral touchdown point limit? We talked about this a little bit yesterday. So Charlie and the group went out, did some measurements, agreed that it was a good technique on the citation. So you're going to be provided in your practices the goal, which we know is center line. That makes sense. And a limit, which you're going to see how that works with visual sight lines through your windshield. It's simple, it's visual. And in between, a warning again, but instead of saying floating now, you're calling drifting. Same concept, goal, warning, limit. Now what happens if you get drifting and floating? We often get this question in the airline world. Well, what do I call if I'm floating and drifting? The situation will work itself out. You'll be calling something, you'll know. And what usually happens first, before you get to your end of your GTZ, your green touchdown zone, you'll probably be drifting first. Don't worry about what you're going to call. Just be aware that something's happening and you've got to react to it. Okay, now this has also come up through our work, but also in the evidence in the data with the CJP study. PAPI versus glide slope misalignment. We've heard about this before, but what is it really? I'm going to spend a moment and work you through this chart. So you here, this is, probably can't see that well. So I'm talking about the threshold here first. Then down the runway, we've got the glide path intercept point, and then the PAPI installation. Notice they're not the same. On this particular runway, which is a long runway, services big airplanes. In order to get the wheel crossing height required over the threshold for a big airplane like a 747, eye to wheel height is 45 feet. You have to have that airplane so high in the air to make sure the gear is over the threshold in an adequate clearance. In order to do that on a big airplane, you have to move that PAPI down the runway to get that correct geometry. Now, if we look at this line, angle B, which is the bottom of the corridor for the PAPI, that's about 2.75 degrees. If you look at the top angle, C, that's 3.25, and in the middle is 3 degrees typically. That's when you get 2 white, 2 red. If you fly 2 white, 2 red, it'll bring you down to that point. If you fly 3 red and a little bit of pink, you're going to fly a 2.75 degree path. It's going to bring you to the same point. You're not going to touch down earlier. You're just going to fly a flatter approach, and you're going to need a little more power. You're going to get to the same point. If you fly 3 white and a little bit of pink, you're going to need less because you're flying a steeper slope. They all go to the same point. Keep that in mind. By flying 3 red, you're not going to touch down earlier. You're just flying a flatter approach. So that's an important point to remember.
And just for relating it to our operation, so Bill talked about 45 feet for the big airplanes. From this point to the cockpit eye height, it's 10 feet in most of our citations. I think the Mustang and the M2 are about 8 feet, and the 4 and the other airplanes that are longer, it's about 10 feet. So we're way under what these guys are dealing with. But if you're flying into an airport where they have to deal with this wheel crossing height clearance for obstacles and other things, and not touching down at or prior to the threshold, you're going to see a discontinuity in the PAPI and when you're looking at your PFD at times. And we're going to talk about different runways that have different scenarios. And that's because we're not in the same kind of situation as the big airplanes.
Yeah, and on smaller runways that service smaller planes, the PAPI will be where the glide slope is. So you'll have alignment. But when you have misalignment, what happens? This aircraft, it's a 737, I think. I don't know, bad picture of a 737. Anyways, the dotted line is the eye path that the pilot is flying, okay? If he's on an ILS and that aircraft is tracking the red line, the ILS, look what happens to his eye path. His eye path comes down, and he's going to be maybe sort of 2 white, 2 red here, comes down, he's going to have 3 red, and then 3 red, some pink, and then 4 red. And you have 4 red, you don't know where you are. That's why you have 4 red, you should do something. But in this case, he's on the ILS, so he's happy. And he's seeing 4 red because he's come below the corridor of the PAPI. They're two systems. They don't talk to each other. They weren't designed together. So it's okay. It's normal to see this as long as you know the reason why and you're following the glide slope.
So this is a major point for awareness when you break out or you transition at the minimum descent or decision altitude to the visual, that there is a discontinuity many, many times, and you should not be following the glide path on your PFD. Those things are meant to be good and valid for you down to the published decision point, but not below. And what we found in the simulator is because of the way we train in the sim, that people tend to follow the glide path on the PFD longer than they should, and they get surprised when they see 4 reds and they look outside. And so that's the awareness here, is start to check where is the PAPI or the VASI physically, longitudinally down the runway relative to your target 1,000-foot point. Is it further or shorter? And that tells you where it's trying to land you on the runway surface.
Exactly. And it's for the big guys, when they have an alignment PAPI, they fly through the top corridor. So they see 3 white and they're on the ILS, and that's okay.
Okay, good.
So here's a visual of what you've maybe even seen yourself in real life. So up circled in yellow on the insert there, you can see on glide slope. But visually, you got 4 red. Now we know about distance markings a little bit. The aiming markers, the big white fat ones, notice they are not at 1,000 feet, because this is not an FAA runway. In the ICAO world, if you fly international a little bit, that aiming marker moves, and it'll move to coincide with the visual approach slope track. So typically on a large runway, that'll be around 1,300 feet. So in this case, he's flying down the glide slope, which is going to intercept the 1,000-foot marker, but he's seeing red on the PAPIs because he's close in.
So here's 3 runways that we frequent. I've been in and out of all of these places. And the situation Bill just described, you can have happen to you at runway 35 left at Colorado Springs. Notice that the PAPI is going to try to get you to cross at 71 feet, and its touchdown point is 1,355 feet down the runway. But the ILS glide path is trying to cross you at 51 feet, 20 feet lower, and touch you down the runway at 974 feet. So you could be really nicely on your PFD glide path, and you're going to see 4 reds when you start to transition. But it's intentionally done that way because it's wanting you to land further down the runway than you might have thought. Ann Arbor, crossing height is 20 feet. That's a 3,500-foot runway, and the VASI for runway 24 is actually closer to the end of the runway. It's trying to touch you down at 382 feet. But if you keep flying the LPV, it's going to try to touch you down 764 feet down the runway, which on this short runway is not helpful. And it's also a short runway used by small airplanes with essentially no eye height to wheel height difference. So the TERPS folks set the VASI intentionally closer to the end of the runway. And then you got Hawthorne, where the crossing heights on the PAPI are 25 and 26 feet with a 57-foot LPV crossing. So these discontinuities are to be expected, and if you're aware of them, you can compensate for them and follow the correct guidance at the right point. Go ahead, question? So, okay, so sorry, thank you for that. So the correct guidance is once you have finished down to the decision altitude, the glide path on the PFD is no longer your primary thing. You're visual. All approaches end in visual. You should be using the visual guidance. So you want to see at least 1 pink and 3 reds, or 2 whites and 2 reds. You correct and you shift your aim point down the runway to get back to the 2 whites and 2 reds. Well, so on the short runway, you see that the VASI and the PAPI were taking you to a 20-foot crossing height. This other one was on a very long runway where the touchdown point and the crossing height were higher. Yeah. That's where the VASI is going to take you. No, in that case, if you cross at 20 feet, you'll see 2 whites, 2 reds. Yep. That's where the PAPI is trying to take you for 2 whites and 2 reds, you will be at 20 feet, okay? Which is what we want on the short runway. Yes, sir?
Is that fairly consistent that when you transition from the PFD to the PAPI, that it's actually going to give you an earlier touchdown point? We're all thinking we're trying to avoid overrun.
Yes.
The last thing I want to do is, oh, I'm nice and figuring I'm going to touch down. Oh, no, I'm actually going to flip a little bit and get 2 over 2.
Yeah, so the 2 over 2 where you're actually going to extend is on that very long runway, which was designed for the bigger airplanes. And it really is your awareness now. You use judgment. Do I want to follow the VASIs and PAPIs in this case, or should I just touch down at 1,000 feet like I'm training myself to do routinely? You're visual, right?
Yeah, what happens if you have none? You can still fly and land. Of course, we learned to do that in early flying. You can use a nominal, 3-degree path to where you want a touchdown. Of course you can. But as long as you're aware of what you're using and the numbers behind it.
Once you're close in and visual and you've got a good sense of where you are, is there anything wrong with ducking under and touching down real early?
So duck under is a tricky term. We don't want abrupt changes in pitch attitude, right? And if you have gone visual out at 300 feet or 200 feet, you can make this adjustment very gradually. It doesn't have to be an instantaneous step function. You're aware that it's going to happen because we're going to show you here where to see these numbers before you start the approach, and you can be recognizing, hey, the VASI is going to cross me here, but the LPV is going to cross me here. When you come out, you know what you're going to see, and you can start to make that change. And I wouldn't call it a duck under in that case because you're planning it, and you're shifting your aim point slightly to get the result you want. You're not going to make a sudden change. So duck under tends to be one of those things that comes from that term. I'm cautious about it because it comes from the old days where you're flying these MDAs on a non-precision and you get in close enough to see the runway and you duck under, right? That's not what we're talking about here. And I don't think that's what you're referring to. But you should have plenty of time. 300 feet altitude's a mile out. You should have time to see the VASIs or the PAPIs and make this correction appropriately and not just follow the glide path on the PFD all the way into the runway. Be thinking about what's the best visual part of the approach reference that you want to use. Be planning for it and stick with it. Does that help?
Yes, I think that's
Yeah.
Are we saying that the SOPs say that you transition, you now go to the VASIs by default, or is it, hey, be aware of this, and make the default? Which are the SOPs?
So the SOPs are going to say avoid 4 reds and avoid 4 whites. Okay, so we like to see 3 reds and a pink as a minimum.
Trent, we probably need to keep moving because we're running late on time, Charlie.
Yeah.
Okay, and just quickly, remember, both the glide slope and the PAPIs get very sensitive lower down. So you want to make subtle corrections and not chase them late. You're going to land and flare the aircraft like you were taught and not make gross changes low down, where a glide path is not sensitive. It's the same deviation regardless.
Yeah, so again, this is going to take a while and you're going to have to adapt this to your flying. Don't try to cut it too tight. Just be aware and it helps, right? Okay, so where do you find this information? The runway diagram will tell you a runway length, but if you're using ForeFlight, you go to Info, go to AFD for the Airport Facility Directory, and it'll take you to the airport, and what you'll see is the LDA. So for this particular airport, my home airport, even though it's got 8,100 feet of runway, it only has 7,250 of landing distance available, so there's 900 feet lost for landing distance due to the displaced threshold, and therefore that number of 7,250 is what I would use in my calculations for things like TPL rather than the full 8,100 feet. Just another awareness item. So the VASI is, you can do some math if you want. Up at the top, you can see on this particular one, it says PAPI, 3 degrees, crossing height 50 feet. That would tell me that 50 feet crossing height on a 3-degree glide path, to use the 20-to-1 rule, it intersects the runway 1,000 feet down. The PAPI should be at about 1,000 feet in that particular case. as you fly into the runway, take a look and see where it is relative to your 1,000-foot marker.
Yeah, and it's not consistent. Some of the runways will tell you PAPI services an eye to wheel height of 45 feet. So then you know it's going to be further down the runway. Unfortunately, the information on PAPI location is not as simple as you'd wish, and it's not consistent.
Okay. All right, so this is the card you have in front of you, and we have a few videos to kind of walk through it. Bill, you want to cover this a
Yeah,
quickly?
so
'Cause we can cover it more in detail as we go through the video, too.
Yes, so this follows the slides we already showed, but in a tabular cue card for you. So at 1,000 feet, a gate call it as 1,000, and down the green column, the goal, things are good. You'll call configured, 500 foot, you go 500 stable. Then you've got your IFR minimums. Remember I said those were separate? But they're worked into this cue card. Then at 200 go-around gate, you call 200 continue. Then you move further on down, you keep on going. If you get into the runway and everything is good, you don't say anything. You just land. Let's go down the right column in the unstable case. So you repeat the offending item at 1,000 feet, it's gear, or flaps. At 500 feet, you do the parameter, whatever it is, airspeed, glide path, bank angle, whatever is the offending parameter, and 200. Okay, why 200? In the simulator trials, remember we said one of the purposes of simulator trials was to detect weaknesses in the procedures and fine-tune them. Well, the 200 call was almost never made. Okay? There was too much cognitive activity going on for the pilots, congestion, other things. It was a very busy time mentally. But remember the center dot and the instruction to look away. It does pull in extra information. So we added this 200 to the parameter call below 500 to draw your attention to the next critical point. And Charlie's done this himself. He says it's effective. It's an addition to the call. It takes a little bit of practice, but once you do it, it helps raise the awareness of your next limit point. So that was a change after the simulator trials intentionally. So you'd make those calls, and let's say you keep on coming down, 200-foot gate, you're not stable, so you'd call limit, go around. Then the touchdown zone gates, if you call at or past the TPL, limit, go around. And of course, off on the left side, if you're floating, you call floating. If you're going off to the side, you're drifting. And there's some other useful notes in terms of energy management and the effect. Remember in the Lufkin accident, Peter went through the effect of being high over the threshold, the effect of being fast. There are some quick remember points at the bottom of what distances are added on when you're not perfectly over the threshold. Now the back of the cue card, do you want to add anything here, Charlie?
No, you're fine.
Okay.
We'll catch up.
On the back of the cue card is some additional information. So you can see the stable approach criteria is outlined there. The visual approach criteria now. Instrument approach. You got stable landing criteria. So everything we've talked about is outlined in a convenient way for you on this cue card.
Okay, so let's run through a few videos real quick. They're very short. This is a work in progress. I took my airplane out and I tried some of these, and I wasn't very good at some of them. You'll hear I don't get the 200 call like Bill says on all of them, but I try to walk you through what does it look like in the cockpit. And you hear a lot of noise and chatter from the tower, so this is kind of real. These are the things you're dealing with, and can you actually integrate this kind of thinking into your flying? So if we could run, the first one's going to be a fully normal. You're going to hear me you're going to see the camera moving around because I'm checking gear and flaps, and then you're going to hear me make a 1,000 call, the 500 call, the 200 continue call, and we'll freeze frame with some overlays on the video to show you some of these points.
And while they're getting that set up, in the simulator what we saw, the airspeed call was made often, but another call was made as well, like I'm fast, I'm fast, I'm fast, meaning the same thing. it doesn't really matter too much. You strive for the perfect call, but if something else comes out, don't worry about it. The intent's being met. You know, if you call bleep, bleep 200, bleep.
So Miller, what comes out from you?
No, this is about awareness. So
no comment.
We promote the proper standard call, but if you say something different.
With Miller, it's some profanity. Okay, let's run through these real quick. Dave, or Bill, if you go to the advance this.
Oh, is this me?
Yeah, it automatically starts. So
okay.
There should be some audio on that, guys. Go ahead and pause it. So this is going into Ogden Runway 3, and this is going to be a fully normal approach where I just make the normal calls. 1,000 configured, 500 stable, 200 continue, and then we'll go out and show you a few where there's some exceedances. Is that going to work, guys, or working it? While we're waiting on that, any questions so far? Did we cover the nuance with the PFD, glide path, and the PAPI good enough for now? Okay. Anything else coming to mind for anybody? Yes, sir, over here. Yeah. 34, okay. So it's normally 46? Yeah, okay. So he's got a 3,400-foot runway available with a displaced threshold, 4,600. Probably use the displaced threshold for takeoff, so 46 for takeoff, 34 for landing, okay? So you have to take the displaced, that's the landing distance available as your 3,400, because you're not supposed to land on the underrun of the displaced threshold, right? So 3,400, and then that's your available, and then let's say your normal landing available is 2,200. I don't know what airplane you're flying, but say it's 2,200. Now you got 1,200 of margin, right? So your red line is, we're going to let you add back 1,000. So your red line is at 2,200 feet down the runway from the displaced threshold. From the displaced threshold. Okay? You could ignore the displaced threshold stuff because you started with the landing distance available, and you can ignore the air distance, so we're going to add that 1,000 back. It sounds like you're using up a lot of it. If you think about it, if your runway, and I did factor you up, you should have factored you up to 25%, but if you have a 2,200 foot, this is kind of amazing to think about. If you have a 2,200 foot normal landing distance in the book, and 1,000 feet of it is in the air, when you hit the ground, theoretically, the test pilot's going to stop that airplane in 1,200 feet. But factor that up, that 2,200 feet times 25%, that's another 500 feet. So it's actually 27. Subtract that from your 32, your TPL is probably 1,500 feet down the runway when I factored it up. Is that helping? Am I going too fast? Yeah, you're intentionally probably landing short, aren't you?
Yeah.
And no problems there. If you're stable and you're controlled and you're intentionally doing a visual aim point shorter, just be aware we don't want you touch. Nobody wants touchdown prior to the threshold, and that's manageable, right? So there's nothing wrong. I do that at Ann Arbor. I go in to see my kids. It's 3,500 feet long, and I am very careful I don't go in there if there's any prediction for wet. And I follow that VASI to cross the threshold at 20 feet, and I touch down 600 feet down the runway, 400 feet down the runway. And it's fine. But if I were to do the 1,000-foot normal thing and not touch down to 1,200 feet and not get on the brakes till 1,500 feet, I haven't done anything for half the runway, right? So yeah, that's a very good example. How we doing? We're going to make it or not? I'm struggling with the audio. Anything else while we're waiting? Yeah, we don't have any in our database other than some that have been associated with extreme icing that was not controlled and having, there was one accident in particular where they stalled as they were approaching the runway due to icing. Peter, do you remember any others?
Okay, we got to cut the question. We have the audio. Charlie, let's go.
All right, let's go. Thank you.
Ready to go?
All right, go to the next one, Bill.
It's not up on the center screen.
Oh, okay.
There we go. Okay.
Here, flaps and 1,000 feet configured.
1,000 feet
Fort
configured.
Cruiser 0 Bravo Foxtrot. Pattern altitude at Ogden is 5,200.
Altitude.
Okay, go to the next one. All right, so what can you use for tools here? That was a 1,000 feet configured call. I got an altitude alert message right as I made it because I set, like I do on a visual, the elevation of the runway in my altitude selector. So I get the altitude call at 1,000. EGPWS is going to give me the 500 call. And then I set my radar min at 200 to give me the minimums call at the 200 gate. So even if I'm not constantly cross-checking my radar altimeter for the 1,000, 500, 200, I've got something cueing me with audio on the approach. And another handy cue is since the folks in the working group picked VREF -5 to VREF +10 for target, if your airspeed lies between VREF and VAP, you know you're in the gate. You're well within the stable approach criteria. So handy cues when you cross-check the PFD. Here's the next gate at 500. Go to the next one.
Airspeed's a little high, but slowing. Wind is dropping off. And the ref, quick ref.
500.
Stable.
There's the call for 500 that helped me, and I called stable right after that.
Pappies look good.
Now I'm talking
Aim
pappies.
point looks good. Airspeed looks good.
Citation 0 Bravo Foxtrot. Traffic is a citation. Short final, low approach on runway 3. Runway 17 clear to land.
A lot of noise there. So you can start to see the pappies in the video
Runway
here,
17,
just
clear
on the
to land,
left
0
side of the
Bravo
touchdown markers. There's the 200. 200 continue.
Notice the pappies are a little bit past the 1,000-foot marker.
Okay, so once visual transition to outside runway references, the VASI, the PAPI become primary, the touchdown zone markers, and a TPL reference. So this will continue here, and there's what it looks like. So my eyes are focused on the PAPI and the VASI, focusing that my aim point, in this case, I want to be at 1,000 feet for this runway. And I've also picked the TPL. In this case, it was taxiway Charlie. And I've got them all in my cross-check.
Archer 30, So 74 Tango, proceed on a suggested heading
Okay,
of
so
210.
this is going to end in a normal,
Remain
and
out
we'll
of
go
low
around
top.
and do another one. And before we start this one, this is going to be a right base to the other runway, and I'm going to have a flaps issue, and then I'm going to have an airspeed issue, and then I'm going to have a drifting issue. So we're going to capture 3 of the problems in one video. The touchdown point limit, I made them do that. It's Charlie. Okay, late flaps, airspeed, and drifting left. Here we go.
4 off runway,
Right here, flaps to go.
Experimental 4 Alpha Romeo, cancel altitude restriction, frequency change approved.
1,000 feet. Flaps, 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 moving, flaps, configured.
Okay, so I was late on 1,000 foot for flaps,
Station 43 Bravo Hotel, wind 150.
but I kept calling flaps till I got them down.
Cleared low approach.
21 cleared to low approach, copy the winds, 43 Bravo Hotel. Blowing.
Okay, I'm going to jump this forward now to the 500-foot call. And on this one, you'll see I don't quite remember to get the 200, airspeed 200, airspeed
Displace
200.
threshold.
Got a displace threshold here as well.
Hold short of runway 17, traffic landing runway 3
500.
to 2.
Altitude.
Airspeed 200. Airspeed 200 next. Airspeed.
I'm sorry, could you
Airspeed.
repeat that? 0 Bravo Foxtrot?
Airspeed. Airspeed.
Sport Cruiser 0 Bravo Foxtrot. Traffic is a citation on a low approach for runway
Stable.
21. Hold short of
Airspeed
runway
stable.
17.
Okay.
500.
Holding short of runway 17. 0 Bravo Foxtrot.
And I was calling 500 early on my radar altimeter,
looks
even
good.
though
A
the
bit low.
audio came in a little late on the EGPWS.
VREF plus just a tad. Stable. 200 next.
200 next.
TPL is taxiway Charlie.
TPL.
Insight.
Now this is a little contrived 200 call. And I'm a little late saying continue, but I finally get
Here's
there.
down. Continue.
Now it's a little contrived because I'm going to set up a drift intentionally, but I wanted you to see the visual. Look at
Drifting. 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 Limit. Go.
Okay, limit go, and notice where the centerline stripe is in the corner of the post and the windscreen.
Going
right?
around.
Going around?
Pickle. Pitch.
Work Cruiser 140 Bravo Foxtrot, caution wait turbulence for the citation on the go.
Charlie, how wide is that runway?
That runway is 150 feet, so I had more than that. We set those limits to protect you on the 50-foot wide runway case. You'll have 10 feet on a 50-foot wide runway between your gear and the grass. Okay. Okay, TPL limit. Start this one at 500.
Way long, so we're going to take like a 20-minute break. So
500.
500, stable. Airspeed looks good, glide path looks good. Main point. Happy's good. TPL's taxiway Charlie.
Okay, TPL at taxiway Charlie, there it is. It's in my sights.
Attention all aircraft information. Delta is now current on the Ogdenatus, runway 17 in use. 508, altimeter 3011.
200 continue.
Defeat.
Well, this is also contrived. I added power
Floating.
to give you what looks like a
Floating?
floating, I mean. So I'm calling floating. And there's taxiway Charlie, TPL limit line, must initiate the go-around. If I'm not physically on the ground past that at that line or prior, then I have an excursion coming at me. Okay, and then the last one is an overshoot to the left of the runway and then a drift to the right. Actually, that's miswritten there. Okay, so we're outside that lateral limit. On approach, the airplane is below 500. It's outside the lateral limit. And you might get here in a couple different ways. Overshoot on a circle.
Runway 17, clear touch and go.
200.
Clear touch and go for 17. We'll keep an eye out for that traffic. 60 Tango.
Okay, so now I've called stable. I'm inside the red line and I'm approaching the green line.
Airspeed stable, glide path stable. 200 continue.
Ogden Towers, Sport Cruiser 140 Bravo Foxtrot, holding short 17.
Drifting.
Sport Cruiser 140 Bravo Foxtrot, Ogden Tower, hold short runway 17.
Okay, drifting to the right. Again, contrived. I intentionally put in a drift. Right drift limit reached when the center line is tangent to the glare shield on the left edge. And again, I made the point that on a 50-foot wide run, my gear would be within 10 feet of the edge. And of course,
Pitch.
going around here. The thing to remember with the drift is even though I've got maybe 10 feet or more of clearance with the runway, and on a 150-foot wide runway even more, if you touch down in that drift with a side load, you're going to have lateral directional problems for steering. So it's again what the team felt was a reasonable limit to start with for SOPs, and something that's easy to reference in the cockpit.
Yeah, and remember, if you're drifting quickly, you don't have to wait to the limit. You can go earlier. You're drifting slowly, and you then get corrected, and you're tracking down the runway, but you're not at the limit, you can land.
Okay, that's all we have. Questions? We've run you way over. I apologize for that, but we thought this was worth doing so to give you the flavor of it. Any questions before we split?
Charlie, this is really great information. For those of you that are thinking, I'll never be able to add these call-outs to my repertoire of call-outs, remember you never said gear down when you flew a 172. So that's why we're going to be doing this over an 18-month period, and you're going to see lots and lots of more repetitive training on this, so it's really groundbreaking stuff.